Hello people, welcome back to another episode of Warships CS, of all things. I guess today's video is going to be a little unusual in the sense that it's going to be not quite a ship review or a gameplay showcase, but much rather, it more or less shows my own difficulties and struggles with this particular ship. The Leander, Tier 6 British light cruiser. And obviously, statistically speaking, I ended up doing okay in these two games, but more or less, my frustration with the way this ship performs and how I can best utilize it remains very much a struggle, if you will. So, I guess I'm just putting this video up to check and see what you guys have to say about what I'm doing in the ship and how the ship should be used, and perhaps, it's going to be a relatively rewarding and educational experience. So, I guess, more or less, as I'm more of a battleship player than anything. I mean, sure, I have played carriers up to Tier 7, and I own one Tier 7 cruiser, but as far as battleships concerned, I have 3 Tier 8s and 1 Tier 9. So, at times I do okay, but I'm by no means an expert as far as cruisers are concerned. And I will say that, at the time when I first got my hands on the Tier 6 British cruiser, the Leander, and quite frankly, essentially along the way, as with all the other British cruisers, it's been a bit of a shocking experience. Not exactly something, I'm used to, or something that's second nature to me, regarding how these ships can be used, if you will. I mean, because for starters, the Leander already has a 13-kilometer range, which means, in order for me to consistently output damage, I have to be relatively close to the enemies. And when you have only a modest amount of HP and questionable armor, that's not necessarily the best possible situation. I guess, speaking of the armor of the Leander, I unfortunately find it somewhat more frustrating, in the sense that, it feels about as thin-skinned as a destroyer, except being a cruiser, it does come with a citadel, which means, if the enemy do hit you there and do go through, damage rolls can be absolutely tremendous. And, before we get to things like the hydro-acoustic surge, as well as the smoke, and perhaps the tricks up his sleeves the ship has, in terms of mobility, I believe the only noteworthy and good thing about the Leander is the fact that it's a ship that doesn't really lose much speed when it turns. And unfortunately, in a straight line, the ship is not quite fast enough, even by cruiser standard. It's capable of 33 knots, notably slower than some of the Russian and Japanese cruisers. They can do 35 or 36, if not 37. And of course, 33 is about as fast as, let's say, something like the Cleveland. But then, the Cleveland has, much stronger armor. Concentrate fire on the designated target. In many ways. A citadel that's kind of, below the waterline and more stowed away. Probably more compromisation. And obviously, when you have sufficient armor thickness, there's also less chance to be freak panned or overmatched, and just allow the enemy to go through you like a hot knife to butter. So in a sense, one way I've been trying to educate myself about how to deal with the Leander is to try to play as a destroyer. Not that I really have much experience as a destroyer driver, That is, utilize your stealth, which means you have to withhold your fire until when the enemies are distracted, or until when you are in a position to make the most out of it, such as you're able to unload a bunch of torpedoes on enemies, or if the enemies are distracted or having his guns aimed away from you, or when your enemies are angled properly so they give you their flat sides and you can make the most out of the situation. And of course, another reason for focusing on broadside enemies, it's the fact that the Leander only carries these semi-armor piercing, semi-high explosive rounds that doesn't start fires, and ultimately requires penetrations to do the most damage. In that case, you have to realize that when you're shooting at angled enemies or bow-on or stern-on enemies, a lot of times the shots will just simply hit the armor at a funky angle and not do much. I mean, in some situations, I would say that the Leander is capable of, spitting out pretty good damage at a moderate distance. Something like maybe 9 kilometers to 12 kilometers. If you're closer than that, then you become quite easy to hit by the enemies. And ultimately, if you face higher tier enemies, you're essentially at a point-blank range. And, so if they hit you with high explosive, the entirety of your superstructure, and quite frankly the entirety of your hull except the citadel, can completely be devastated by the enemies. They will knock out modules, they will start fires, and in terms of damage rolls, they roll high. But then if they do fire armor piercing, I believe the citadel for this ship has absolutely no problem being penetrated and destroyed by the enemies. So unfortunately, the important macro when you're playing this ship is to not be hit to begin with, as many people will say, and as I have learned. But then when you have to fire these APs shells rather than HE shells, and then certain enemies in certain positions are relatively impervious to firepower, and then you also don't have a lot of range to work with. A lot of times you kind of get forced into a bit of a white knuckle, close range brawling situation, which unfortunately the ship's armor scheme and protection scheme is very ill-suited for.
Attention, reporting the target position.
So it's a bit counterintuitive in a sense that as far as I figured out, sometimes when you are playing another ship, such as maybe a German battleship, or something that offers a degree of durability and staying power, sometimes it might be worthwhile to take a couple of hits and to let your armor do the work and let your angling do the work and damage enemy in return. Perhaps you can out-trade the enemies, but with the Leander, that just never seems to be the case. Because every shot the enemy hits you with, the risk of them rolling high and doing a number on you is quite significant, if you will. Perhaps the specialty for the Leander, as well as many of the other British cruisers, such as the Emerald at Tier 5 or the Dene at Tier 4, as I've showcased before on the channel, is the fact that they essentially have the repair consumable. They can use the hydrostatic search, or should I say the hydro-acoustic search consumable, as well as the fact that they can pop smoke. But the thing about that is that even when you are firing smoke, the smoke doesn't really last long enough in some situations for you to do enough damage on enemies. And also, even when you are in smoke, if you're firing, I believe, if the enemies are within 7 kilometers, they can spot you anyways. So the really difficult part of playing the ship is the fact that you have to engage enemy at a range below your maximum range, obviously, but then also at a range above the distance in which the enemy can spot you when you're in your smoke. And ultimately, the smoke is something that makes or breaks the ship. And my captain has the superintendent skill, which means, he gets extra charge of every single consumable on the ship. So, damage repair, hydro-acoustic surge, as well as smoke. But unfortunately, ultimately, in some situations, that still may not be enough. Because, for example, we have 3 charges of smoke at a minute and a half each time. That's ultimately really not that much time for you to, make the most out of it. And obviously, when you're smoking, you're vulnerable to carriers, you're vulnerable to torpedo attacks, you're vulnerable to being sneaked up upon. Because the smoke cloud your ship's capable of popping is already so big, and you cannot really stray outside of your smoke cloud, or you essentially run the risk of being exposed. But then when you are sitting in the smoke, even though the enemies couldn't see you, the smoke cloud is just so big, so they can even fire blindly into the smoke or charge you, and ultimately there's not enough you can do. As with this bottle, essentially what you will see is the fact that I essentially started no fire because I couldn't really start fires unless my secondaries hit them, and I'm constantly struggling with the range and detectability of the ship. And my bridge's torpedoes, even though they're good, and I can fire them a single torpedo at a time to allow me to micro-adjust and micromanage the placement of my shots. Even though it's a good asset, it's not as usable as I would like. I mean, they do good damage and they have good speed, but they're 8-kilometer torpedoes, so ultimately they're not Japanese torpedoes. You can't really snipe with them. And you have 4 tubes on one side. I guess your torpedo scheme is ultimately also not sufficient for the sake of area denial. You cannot do what a destroyer does, spam an entire area with torpedoes to deny the enemies from going into it or to force the enemy to maneuver. The ship just doesn't cover enough, or should I say this ship just doesn't carry enough torpedoes to do that, unfortunately. As right now, I decided to reverse and angle my hull. In a sense, that will make myself somewhat harder to hit by the enemy battleships, which obviously I know have inferior accuracy versus my ship. And obviously, some people might say that because you're bow onto the enemy, perhaps the angling of the bow plating of your ship will troll some of the enemy's projectiles. Or if they do pan, maybe they'll just go right through without detonating and causing a low damage overpan. But as I found out with the Leander, essentially, and unfortunately, the thickness and durability of the ship's plating, whether it be the superstructure or the bow or the stern or any part of the hull above the wing belt or the citadel, really doesn't have enough armor to troll the enemy shots, no matter how well you angle. Or much rather, in practice, it's not something you should count on, as much as something that you want to actually do. And unfortunately, for myself, the enemy destroyers being a destroyer that carries more torpedoes than myself, or at least, as a Japanese destroyer, it's more suited as a torpedo boat, essentially spammed torpedoes, or quite frankly multiple torpedoes into my direction, and I got hit by one. And I will say that, these armor-piercing shells can do okay against this destroyer, simply because, they're British shells with a short fuse. So, in situations in which a high-explosive shell from another nation's ship might simply overpan a destroyer, sometimes these shells will detonate in the destroyer, even though they're high-explosive. And unfortunately, you couldn't start fire with them, so sometimes, you have to be more diligent with your shooting. Well, another thing I kind of know how to do with the torpedoes is to, I guess, use torpedo launchers to bait enemies into maneuvering into a position in which they become more vulnerable to other sorts of attacks, whether it be, gunfire or more torpedo attacks. As you can see, while I was brawling against the enemy Warspite, I fired two torpedoes in his projected path. And obviously he noticed that or anticipated that, so he turned and they essentially threw his guns off course and positioned him for to be hit by more torpedoes on the other side. But ultimately and unfortunately, at this point I only have low health left, and the enemy have a New Mexico American Tier 6 battleship that has way more health. I guess the rest of my team just simply expired, if you will. But then at this point, I popped my smoke, but my smoke also obscures my vision, so I couldn't spot the enemy. If I stick myself outside the smoke cloud, sure, I will see the enemy, I will spot him, but then he will also see me. And I have no allies to spot for me, obviously. And some people might say that, I could have taken a catapult fighter on my ship, or quite frankly a spotter aircraft on my ship, but I didn't do that. And the reason is because, I believe in order for me to have a shipborne aircraft, I will have to trade the smoke consumable, which is quite frankly a really bad trade, considering how fragile and short range this ship is. And so I decided to sail away from the smoke cloud in hopes of the enemy miscalculating and making a mistake. Perhaps I can hit him with torpedoes or do something. Because, at this point, my own initiative is not something that's going to do much good. As soon as I expose myself, I become subject to damage. And then, consider my armor scheme, that's not really something my ship can do well with. Sure, I'm resetting the enemy's capping progress. My team's urging me forward, but I know that he has 14-inch guns. If he fires high explosives, he's gonna get some pretty good hits and pretty good rolls on my ship. If he fires armor piercing, he'll go right through. And, overpan will be a sort of a lucky thing. But even then, that will kill me. So, I got a Kraken and a loss. That's that. I guess with today's second replay, I'm also in my Leander. This happened, a couple of days after the other replay. And even though, I ended up doing okay statistically, I'm still struggling and fumbling with, how the ship performs. I guess, in a sense, this replay ended up being a win, and, it's a bit of a payback for me, but ultimately I still find this ship to be a bit of a struggle. and perhaps there should be some kind of rebalancing regarding the ship at some point. Maybe a little bit of a range boost. Maybe allow these semi-armor piercing shells to start fires. Maybe, count the bow and stern plating, if not the superstructure plating, as being thicker than the way they're designated now, which is effectively as thick as soda cans. One thing people will say that's good about British cruisers is the fact that, as I mentioned, they turn well without losing speed, but they also accelerate very well. This might seem to be a good asset, but from my perspective, it's also a liability, because sometimes you kind of get yourself into positions, especially forward positions and exposed positions, too soon. And, if your allies in battleships, and if they don't even have an SSD and they're slow to load, sometimes you are completely trashed up even before your allies got into the game. But then you think my ship couldn't really do damage consistently unless it's at a certain range, unless the enemy behaves a certain way. Perhaps it's good and important for me to spot for the team a little bit. And perhaps that's one of the motivations for why you want to push forward and encounter the enemies first. But unlike the way things are meant to be in warfare, the scouts or the vanguard encounters the enemy, and the information is shared with the rest of your elements and units, and then perhaps your vanguard can then retreat while being supported by the friendlies. Now, unfortunately, with Warship it just doesn't happen, because sometimes people just like to derp around and do their own thing. It's habitual that many people are just outright cowardly in this game. They avoid engagements, or perhaps they barely engage an enemy at maximum range, taking poorly aimed or even unaimed pot shots in enemies. I mean, sure, sometimes being close to the enemy would make yourself vulnerable to being hit and to being overwhelmed, but then at the same time, it also becomes easier for you to hurt an enemy in return. But perhaps ultimately all this stuff doesn't matter if your allies are incompetent or apathetic. Another thing I noticed about the Leander is the fact that the guns seem to have a relatively slow velocity and a high arc, so sometimes you have to lead enemy targets quite far away. It's not ideal, in terms of being intuitively easy to handle, easy to shoot with. But then, there are a couple benefits to this approach. First of all, these guns allow you to use terrain features well. Sometimes you can hide behind a ridge or hide behind an island, and you can still put fire into the enemies, while their guns with higher velocities and lower arcs couldn't, return fire effectively. And other times, when you're hitting enemies at close to your maximum range, your shells will often hit their deck armor rather than their side hull armor. And usually the deck armor is thinner than their armor belt or their side hull armor, so you can probably do more. But then ultimately, unless you're hitting a enemy light cruiser, or at most sometimes a heavy cruiser, the best possible situation you can hope for these shells would be for them to hit the relatively unarmored or under-armored parts of enemy ships and essentially do full damage. Because obviously their citadel, if they're well protected, if they're well armored, these shells won't do much to them. and obviously they wouldn't start fires. And unfortunately, as much as you hope for normal pens, a lot of times, ultimately, these shells will just simply shatter even when they hit a modest patch of enemy armor. And other times, they will ironically overpen. So unfortunately, there's not much consistency to it all. As in this situation now, I'm essentially splitting the fire between the enemy Cleveland as well as the enemy Monarch, Tier 8 British battleship. A lot of people will say that splitting your fire between enemy targets, it's wasteful and risky because you are simply collecting damage, but you're not focusing on eliminating enemy guns from the battleship or stressing the battlefield. But when you are Leander, essentially what you have to notice it's how the enemies have angled themselves, how the enemies have positioned themselves. We have two enemies that are maneuvering. Always shoot the one enemy that's less angled, because your shells will do more. It's ultimately the hard mode, because if you're a cruiser with more range or more pen or higher velocity shells, perhaps it's more likely that you just do solid damage anyways. Or if you have HE shells, that shouldn't be a problem either, because regardless of how the enemies position themselves, HE shells will always splash and do some damage, and they're gonna start fires, and sometimes HE shells will also penetrate the relatively under armor parts of enemy ships. I mean, sure, ultimately these AP shells can do that too, but then sometimes when these guys hit a module, these guys hit an angle, when there's multiple layerings of enemies' armor schemes, these guns really disappoint. They just don't behave. And as you can see, right now I'm essentially focusing on the enemy Monarch, who is sailing away and stern onto my ship. Obviously, in this kind of situation, my puny little shells, should they ever hit any part of the enemy's hull, obviously his armor belt in particular, which has well over 12-inch armor, they're not gonna do a thing. They will just shatter like a pebble, if you will. So my goal was to focus on his superstructure, and that happened continuously until I found this enemy destroyer. I mean, sure, my gun's not gonna start a fire, and they'll probably overpan and so on and so forth. Being a cruiser, or having a cruiser's accuracy in handling versus a battleship, allows me to engage an enemy destroyer with a reasonable degree of confidence, especially in place of my allies, who might struggle. It's funny, sometimes I have heard, people trying to come up with this analogy between the Leander and the Kutuzov at Tier 8, the Soviet Tier 8 premium cruiser. Partly because, both ships are light cruisers with 6-inch guns, as well as they can pop smoke. But ultimately, I find the two ships not exactly comparable, partly because the Kutuzov has a significantly higher rate of fire, I believe, as well as the fact that he has really good range for a 6-inch armed cruiser. If anything, the Kutuzov easily has as much range as a Tier 7 battleship. I believe it's like over 18 kilometers. So sometimes, proximity and distance is, really the best protection. It's arguably better than armors. Better than stealth, partly because, sometimes your stealth kills off, or much better than stealth gets killed off when you fire. I mean, ultimately, you know, if you have that much range, as in 80 kilometers, popping smoke might be a safer proposition because if the enemies try to guesstimate their blind fire, return fire, it's much less likely for them to be able to do much to you. And unfortunately, another thing I learned about the British cruisers is to habitually shy away from engagement at, you know, the right time. You know, use your stealth to get away a little bit, use your smoke, and, you know, hang tight onto the enemies, get annoyed of not being able to chase them down, and, you know, focus their attention onto your allies, and then you can probably re-engage them. As with this situation now, you know, even though I know my shots aren't gonna do much because they won't start fires and the enemy's aiming well, at least I'm keeping the enemy busy. I'm keeping the enemy engaged. He has to constantly think about what am I doing. You know, because ultimately I can get up close and use my torps, or I can maybe pop another smoke and do more damage from the smoke. And perhaps the enemy kind of tunnel visioned on me a little bit, and then he got blindsided by our destroyer. And sometimes, you know, providing that kind of support might be able to, you know, help your team win. It is what it is. And now the situation remains a close game because the enemies have 3 battleships left. Meanwhile, we have 1 battleship, myself, a cruiser, as well as 2 destroyers. In terms of raw firepower as well as health, I think the enemies have an upper hand on us. Even though at this point we are leading the cap points, as well as, you know, if our destroyers are smart, we can probably fight a fairly decent stealth/vision fight against enemies. But then sometimes, you know, that's too much to ask for your allies. What I've decided to do right now is I notice the enemy battleships are slowly but surely charging our friendly battleship towards the north of myself. And just simply because the way these decide to push forward this, they essentially expose their flat broadside onto me. So I decided to, you know, try to chew down on them a little bit while they do this. And obviously I'm also using this island as a cover. So perhaps, you know, they could return fire on me. And, you know, should they try to rush me and get close, I might survive long enough to deliver a torpedo strike. But ultimately, you know, a lot of times, the torpedo attack, the enemies can't really dodge, and they can't miss. Or should I say, you can miss. It's one that's far from a point-blank range. Just simply because, you know, their ships are so big and they can only turn so fast. Even if they try to do their best, they just simply couldn't get away.
Torpedoes to port.
And unfortunately, the enemy Baron decided to ram me, and obviously he had high explosive in his barrels, so ended up starting a fire and did pretty solid damage on myself. But then I survived long enough to deliver a rapid spread of torpedoes. Not really the traditional way of firing torpedoes in a British cruiser, because normally you can micromanage the trajectory of every single torpedo. But then, you know, I felt that, you know, I might not survive long enough to micro-adjust and click 4 times. And because the enemy's a relatively large battleship at a close range, none of my torpedo missed. Although, unfortunately, the enemy survived long enough to take all 4 torpedoes and then ram me to death. Not exactly a good trade, considering I had a reasonable amount of health even before then. But you know, perhaps sometimes sacrifices are necessary in order for your team to achieve victory in the end. It is what it is. And you know, I've always found the tail end of this replay to be kind of amusing. Our friendly Hatsuharu Tier 6 Japanese destroyer, it's desperately trying to, you know, take out enemy battleship with his small guns. But then, he just doesn't seem to be hitting much at all. You know, I guess, you know, that very much fits with the stereotypes of Japanese destroyers having bad guns. You know, sure, a lot of times I assume, you know, maybe they have a relatively slow turret rotation, maybe they have limited range and a poor reload, maybe they don't handle so well. But you know, this is a bit of a shocker because consider the fact that they're modest in caliber, I will assume at a modest range, they should behave, but just don't. So I guess ultimately, I don't know if the statistics is enough to show that, you know, I have figured out what to do with these ships. And I also don't know if my frustration with these ships are universal. I'm sure some people do well in them. And I always felt that, you know, good damage counts and good XP doesn't mean that, you know, the experience is good. You know, the gameplay makes sense. It almost feels as if the Leander, as well as many of the other British cruisers, are really meant to be a destroyer leader. You know, perhaps, you know, when you have a small raiding group that can provide support to each other, and there's multiple charges of smoke that you guys can share, you know, you might do better. Because, you know, on one side, this ship is not quite stealthy to the point of being a destroyer, or maneuverable to the point of being a destroyer. But then, you know, when it works with destroyers, it does have more health. And even though it's fragile, it might be able to survive a little longer. And it might also be able to better counter the typical counters for destroyers, such as aircraft or cruisers. As with the second replay, ended up doing even more damage at 111k. Good profits, even though I only managed to rank number 3 in terms of XP. But consider, you know, how I rack up this damage, you almost feel as if without good range and without the ability to start fires, how much damage you can do really depends on how cooperative the enemies are and how lucky you are. Because ultimately I lucked out because, you know, I had multiple enemies that went broadside onto me and kind of got distracted and didn't do enough to make a stand to take me out. And meanwhile, you know, close to half the damage were done to a high health enemy battleship that decided to rush me and ignore the fact that I have torpedoes. Well, it's a good thing it happened, but ultimately, it's not something I can count on.